Welcome to the Fight Like a Mother podcast. I am Cheryl Cardall, your host. You have landed in a wonderful community where we give non-judgmental support for parents raising kids with mental health and other neurodiverse challenges. My main goal is to provide resources and especially a soft place to land. Go find me on Instagram and join our awesome community of parents under my name, Cheryl Cardall. Now on with the episode. Welcome back to the Fight Like a Mother podcast. I am super excited to have my guest on today. Robyn Gobbel is her name. And I have been following her on Instagram for a bit and really resonate with much of what she shares. Robyn recently published a book that I'm about halfway through, and I think it will be a very important resource for people in my community. So we'll talk about that more at the end and where they can find that and things. But Robyn, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Cheryl, for having me.
Would you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you got into that kind of work, and just share a little bit about yourself?
I'd love to. I am a former therapist. I did my adult career as a therapist with kids with actually mostly histories of complex trauma.
Mm.
And that's really the only work I've ever wanted to do. Like since I was in high school, I wanted to work with the toughest kids that nobody else wanted to work with. So I've really focused like my schooling and my education, all my training on working with those kids. And I also had an interest, especially in attachment and attachment trauma. So ultimately what that kind of led to for me was a clinical expertise in working with kids who had experienced trauma, abuse, neglect, and ultimately some pretty baffling, out of control behaviors. It wasn't uncommon for me to be fourth, fifth therapists or more that families had gone to, just feeling like nobody can help us.
Yeah.
So over the years, as I got kind of maybe more public, was doing more on social media and blogging, all that kind of stuff. I started to hear more from families whose kids they would also have described as baffling, but maybe they wouldn't have said have a history of trauma.
Right.
And that kind of combined with a deeper understanding of the nervous system, of the stress response system, of, like where behavior even comes from.
Yeah.
I really now just talk about kids who have sensitized stress response system, lots of vulnerability in their nervous systems, and then these big baffling behaviors. So I no longer work as a therapist. I left the therapy office about 4.5 years ago, so that I could kind of serve in a bigger way.
Right.
And now I write and train and teach and have communities and try to serve and support as many families around the world as I can.
Yeah, and what you're doing is so vital, because I know we have some big baffling behaviors in my household, and trying to find people who understand and who can give you resources is really tricky. It's really difficult. And I know you know that because you work with so many families that finding that community or those people that can actually explain to you what's happening or give you the resources is sometimes feels impossible.
Yeah. Sometimes it is impossible.
It is. You're exactly right. It is.
Yeah.
So thank you for what you do, because there's those of us out here who need it so desperately. And I think there's probably more who need it that aren't sharing because they're worried about the judgment and the fear and, all the things that people tend to kind of pigeonhole their kids and families into. So thank you for all that you do. Well, one of the things that inspired me to ask you to be on the podcast was one of your Instagram posts and a blog you had about, it's titled 9 Reasons Why Parenting a Child with a Vulnerable Nervous System Can Be Traumatic. And the reason why I wanted you to come on is because that's not something I hear people talking about very often, is that it can be traumatic to parent these kids who struggle so much. And we'll get
Yeah.
into that in a little bit. But first, I want to focus on, what does a vulnerable nervous system look like?
For me, I feel like a vulnerable nervous system is any nervous system that is experiencing the world stressors with more sensitivity than
Right.
maybe would be expected. And I use the word expected just to talk about, sort of our stereotypes of what quote unquote normal is. They're not necessarily language I use,
Right.
but they can be helpful language with communicating, kind of what we mean.
Right.
So really any nervous system that has this extra sensitivity, extra vulnerability, in their stress response system, which what that usually means then is, the parents are describing these kids as, overreacting. Their behaviors don't make any sense. They're having enormous meltdowns over nothing is often what folks say, or they're really using words like, I'm so confused. I'm so baffled. I have no idea why this child is doing this, justifiably pretty bizarre things. Or, some kids kind of go the other direction, and instead of explosiveness, they tend to be shutting down, collapsing, but it can still feel like that same level of bafflingness to parents. They're like,
Yeah.
I don't know what's wrong. I don't know why they're doing this. And I don't know what to do. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes. I actually have kids that do both.
Yeah.
One's kind of the big baffling, sometimes scary behaviors. It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde situation.
Yep.
And then I have kids that just shut down, won't talk,
Yep.
Kind of curl up in a fetal position. And it's like both. I'm like, I don't know what to do here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's interesting that you would point out that both of those are nervous system responses, because I think we often think of the big, violent, yelling type behaviors, that's a sensitive nervous system, but so is the other, that they shut down.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's really common. What you just described is totally common. For a lot of reasons, shutting down is more socially acceptable.
Yes.
It's not causing us as much stress. A lot of families have both, kind of like what you just described. And so when you've got kids who are, violent and kids who are shutting down, it just makes a lot of sense that all the energy is going to the child who's violent, right? Like that's just where all of our attention is going. That makes totally perfect sense. But yeah, we do sometimes lose sight of the fact that both are overactive stress responses.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's really good to point that out. Just differing responses, but they're both come from the same thing. So let's talk about that nervous system for a bit and kind of explain that and why it's causing those type of behaviors.
Yes. So if I get too sciencey and you're like, whoa, Robyn, I did not want to go down that rabbit hole.
Let's go sciencey.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay. So the autonomic nervous system is a part of our nervous system that's responsible for exactly what it sounds like. All of our automatic parts of our body, right, that keep us alive. So our heart rate, our respiration, breathing,
right,
all that kind of good stuff, as well as energy, arousal, and activation. And so like our autonomic nervous system powers us, right? Like, for example, right before coming on to this meeting, like both of us, actually, you more than me, had something that like caused our time to crunch down, right?
Yes.
I was just looking for something I couldn't find, and I'm all over the place like, right? And so both of us, I'm assuming, had a spike in our activation and our energy and arousal in our nervous system. One, because we had this kind of extra task to accomplish. And then also, there's these feelings of like, I want to be on time. I'm about to meet a stranger. I want to, have a good impression. I want to respect this person's time, right? So we've got all that kind of stuff that's in there. All of it's driving extra energy and arousal in our nervous system. Now, neither of us sat and thought like, I need a little extra energy to be as less late for this meeting as possible, right? Like it just happened automatically, right? So there's like the accelerator side of our autonomic nervous system gives us energy. And then there's the brake side, right? And so I had a couple more minutes to find my brakes before you did, right? So I kind of found my brake, and then you logged on, and we even took a moment, right? For like you to find your brake too, because it's kind of hard to think straight when you've got a lot of extra energy, if kind of coursing through your nervous system that you don't need, right? Like here we are, we're sitting in front of microphones, we're sitting down, we're together, we're socially engaged. Neither of us need a lot of sympathetic activation anymore.
We're safe here. Yeah.
Exactly. So our autonomic nervous system is responsible for those ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and is ultimately kind of powering our stress response system, which is exactly what it sounds like, the system that engages to respond to stress and helps us tackle that stress and then kind of like return to baseline. So we all have a stress response system. We all have an autonomic nervous system for a wide variety of reasons. Some folks can develop a lot of sensitivity in their stress response system. And so what ends up happening is we've got teeny tiny little stressors, objectively speaking, like to the person, they're not tiny, but objectively speaking, we got teeny tiny little stressors that are accompanied by huge responses. So usually when parents will say something like, they're totally overreacted, they freaked out over nothing, and we'll kind of deconstruct it a little, and they'll tell me about like dinner was 5 minutes late, or they were out of their favorite cereal, right? And so fair enough, these are small stressors, but they're still stressors, right? So we don't freak out over nothing. What usually is happening is that there's just such a disproportionate reaction that it feels that way. But if we paused and looked at it, we'd be like, oh no, like I'm stressed when I'm looking forward to my favorite breakfast cereal and it's not there too. Like that is a moment, right? Of like, oh, bummer, disappointment.
Yes.
Hardly even registers with us because our stress response system navigates that stress without a lot of difficulty, and it moves on. Like it knows things like, there's other things I can have for breakfast. Right. And it's okay if I don't always eat my favorite cereal, and I'll get my favorite cereal again someday, right? Like all of those things help our stress response system respond in a way that like matches
the circumstance. Yeah.
Exactly. But the kids that I work with are, chucking cereal boxes across the room when it's not the one they want. And so then they look bratty or manipulative or selfish or entitled. They look all these things, but really all they are kids with really sensitized stress response systems.
So their stress response, so can't manage even what we see as super small. Like, I'm out of Captain Crunch. Well, what a big deal is that? But to them, that almost feels like a life or death thing. I mean, is that that too extreme to say that?
I mean, if you have a kid who's like responding violently, then there is a part of their nervous system that's having a life or death experience.
Wow.
And that I know that there's a part of that makes no sense, but actually all behavior always makes sense. And so that like a violent response is a behavior that comes because of a, feeling like your life is in danger. There's really actually no other reason for humans to be violent. So some part, for whatever reason, that is feeling like this stressor is so big. It feels like my life is in potential danger.
Yes.
They have just extremely poor frustration tolerance.
Yes. And, I mean, I can see why parents respond, this is not that big of a deal. Like, why are you freaking out about Captain Crunch?
For sure, of course.
And so, like, how do we handle that dysregulation with them? How do we handle the fact that we have 10 holes in our walls because of we're out of Captain Crunch? How do we handle that?
Well, there's not, unfortunately, one
Right,
specific
right.
answer to that question.
Because
And
there's,
I unfortunately know you know that. And so do all your
yeah,
listeners, because if you'd found it,
we
wouldn't
we
even
would
be
not have
here.
these problems. Yes.
Exactly. I wish there was a clear answer to that question. But what I do think there's an answer to is we can do the detective work to get clearer on what is happening in the stress response system and in the nervous system. And then we've got kind of these two things we have to work on. One is strengthening the stress response system outside periods of stressors.
Right.
Right. So that when there are stressors, the stress response system can respond, with more strength.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of putting a hole in the wall, maybe they say, "Oh, I hate it when we're out of Captain Crunch," which would actually be a wonderful
Yes.
reaction
Yes.
to disappointment. Like, what is totally appropriate reaction to disappointment? I hate it when I'm looking forward to cereal and I'm out as well. Big bummer.
Right.
So we strengthen the stress response system and we do that. And of course, we can talk about that more specifically, but we do that kind of outside the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the moment, right? So we're facing a situation, we're out of Captain Crunch, your child's having a reaction. In the work that I do, I help parents kind of see the stress response through two different pathways and then 4 different levels on each pathway in increasing intensity. So there's 4 levels of increasing intensity. Mm-hmm. And I help parents kind of start to recognize where their child is, what behaviors of their child, what kind of cues and clues their child have that lets them know maybe a good guess about kind of where their child is, in that continuum. And then how we respond is based on that.
Right.
Right. So if I'm working with a parent and their kid is literally all the way to the end violent, unfortunately, and anybody who has a kid who's violent knows that this is unfortunately true, there is absolutely nothing I could teach you to do about how to handle that in the moment. Right. Like what I tell parents is keep everyone safe. Do whatever you have to do.
That's it.
And we could talk about what that looks like in your specific home. How do you keep that room safe? How do you, keep objects out? Like what is, but I would need to know a lot more specifics about a family to be able to do that. So unfortunately, yeah, if we're really talking about, violence, the response is, whatever you have to do to keep them safe. What we want to think about more. I mean, so often parents do want well, just tell me what to do. Tell me what to do in the moment. And I get that, but actually the way more important times are not in those stressful moments. And what are the steps that we can do? So the thing is we know how to strengthen the stress response system. We know how it happens. We know how the stress response system develops. So we can use that as a model for how to help somebody who has maybe a delay in the development of their stress response system, or it's just a lot of sensitivity and a lot of vulnerability. And then of course, some kids need a lot of accommodations. Like some kids have a nervous system that it just is what it is. We're not going to change it, and we need to make accommodations to them. But some kids certainly have some things happening for them that we could, take some steps to kind of strengthen that stress response system so that eventually, I don't have your favorite cereal. Maybe at first, instead of physical violence, comes down to some verbal aggression. And maybe it sounds like, I hate you. You're so stupid. How can you never have my favorite cereal? Which, again, is not an ideal response to stress. No, not by any means. But it does show a little progression in the stress response system to move from physical to verbal. And then I help parents see oh no, we're just going to stay on that path. I'm not saying this verbal aggression is acceptable. We're not going to stay here.
Yes.
but we can see how it is progress.
Yes.
So let's keep on this path so that maybe eventually your child can just say, I hate it when we're out of my favorite cereal.
Yeah. Well, and I think provide things in your home that we have a punching bag out in our garage. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, sometimes it's used, sometimes it's not,
Mm-hmm.
but it's there. And I think there's different things in your home that you can set it up so that there are options for them to go to. Or, my kid who shuts down, we created a quiet corner, has soft
Yeah.
things, and it has, he knows he can go there, it's safe. He can play with the fidgets. He can have a soft, warm blanket. And so I think there are things that we can do to provide those options. They might not take them, but they're
Right.
there for them.
Well, you are describing something so important, which is, if possible, if you can not get too hooked into whatever the bad behavior is,
Mm-hmm.
but look at it with a lot of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
we can sometimes get some good ideas about about what our child actually needs.
Yeah.
Right. So when I have kids who are hitting or kicking,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't just assume that they're violent kids. I think
Right.
about, I'm like, a violent kid could be violent in all sorts of ways. They could throw things, they could bite things, they could bite you, they could do all sorts of things. Why hitting? So then I think about, like, well, what's the sensory experience that comes with hitting and making contact with something and or kicking? And is there a way that we can kind of organize
Mm.
that behavior so that I'm always making the assumption that the behavior is an attempt at regulation.
Oh,
It
wow.
doesn't
That's
seem
so
like it,
interesting.
but I'm always making an assumption that that behavior is the body's sometimes misguided attempts
Mm-hmm.
at regulation. So if I've got a kid who's hitting a lot, I am thinking about a punching bag, not necessarily from the idea of, like, I want to help them get their anger out, but I'm actually really thinking about it through this. The behavior is like the thrust of the arm, right? And then the making contact with something. And there's a movement that happens in the shoulder, and then we
Mm.
make contact with something. And there's a reason. Again, kids could be violent in a lot of different ways.
Right.
Why that way?
Interesting.
And
That's
is
really
there a
interesting to think about.
way I can help the body get its need met, but without anybody getting hurt, in a
Right.
more regulated
Right. I worked
way?
I worked with a mom who had a 6-year-old who was still biting when she was getting
Yes.
frustrated, but she would only bite mom.
Uh-huh.
And she's like, "What do I do?" And I'm like, somehow she's trying to do something orally. She has that need. So she ended up buying her all these things that she could bite, and they tried all
Yeah.
these things, and it helped. It did help, but it took a while. This isn't
Yeah.
an easy fix, and it might not work all the time. But yeah, I think you're right. I love that their body is telling them you need to regulate by hitting something for some reason. And so let's figure that out. That's really fascinating.
Yes. And hitting something and biting as well gives the body this input called proprioception.
Yes.
And so, in proprioception, generally speaking, is regulating. And so, if we can see these behaviors kind of through that lens, I think they're trying to bring in some regulation into their body in a way that's totally inappropriate. We can't allow it to continue. But what could we offer? What
Mm-hmm.
could we do that might help them get some of that sensory input in, that they're demonstrating that they are seeking, in a way
Right.
that helps them actually regulate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff. I could talk to you about this all day long because it's so interesting. Um, but I wanted to talk about how this impacts parents. So I love these ideas of digging deep as to what these behaviors are telling us about what this child needs and why their nervous system is so sensitive. And
Yeah.
I think accepting that and recognizing, okay, we got to do some things differently and provide opportunities for them to be able to regulate. I also want to chat about how this affects us as parents with
Yeah.
kids with these really challenging behaviors. And I'll just share a little bit first because we have some of these things happen at my house. And um, it wasn't until very recently that I was like, I'm dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
I have been dealing with trauma here. And I think as moms, there's a little bit of shame that
Yeah.
happens saying that out loud, that these parenting challenges can cause trauma. And it really, I mean, we've been dealing with this for years. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, sometimes I don't want to get out of bed. And sometimes I'm feeling depressed. And a lot of that has to do with probably the layers of trauma that have happened over the years. So I would like that post that you shared about parenting trauma. I was like, aha.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of parents out there who maybe don't know about that or feel shame at admitting that or
Yeah.
talking to somebody about it. So let's chat about that.
Yeah. I'd love to start actually with why this feels shameful,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that is really at the crux of all of it. Like that's the part we have to like really deconstruct, is releasing all the shame from this so that people can then get what they need.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of reasons it feels shameful to say parenting is traumatic to me.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is because, like, culturally, at least here in Western culture, we've really been sold this lie that parents are responsible for their child's behavior.
Yes.
That somehow I'm in control of them.
Yes.
And the truth is that there's no human on the earth who's in control of any other human's behavior. None, zero, zilch. And I do think that parents with kids who have kind of more robust or more flexibility in their nervous system
Mm-hmm.
can kind of trick themselves into thinking that they're in control of their child.
Yes.
And so
100%.
we don't really notice that we're not in control of our kids until they become like teenagers. And then there's this kind of lie that's like, oh, it's because they're teenagers. No, it's because they're humans.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no human is in charge of any other humans. And if we remember that, we have to then get really curious about, why would I feel shame because of someone else's behavior? And the
Yeah.
only reason to feel shame about that is if we think somehow we're responsible for it. Now, there are so many things, of course, that parents can do to influence their kids' behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
Right.
goodness that's why we're here. If we
Right.
didn't think we could do that, we wouldn't even be talking about this. But influencing and controlling, or like being in charge of, are just not the same
Right.
thing. And that is a really deep-seated cultural belief
Uh-huh.
that good parents have kids who seem more regulated.
Mm-hmm.
Bad parents have kids who seem less regulated. And those two things aren't, neither of those things are true.
Yes. Well, and I
Yeah.
think also the society, I mean, I get a call from the school. Well, this is happening. What are you going to do about it?
Exactly.
And I'm
Right.
like,
No, I
I
mean, there's
don't
all these
know.
cultural. I know.
Yeah, you're the
I mean,
educator. Like I have control over that behavior that happened at school. And so I think society puts this into us that your child is misbehaving. It must be a problem with you.
oh, society absolutely
Yes.
has this belief that somehow we're in control of other people's behaviors. What is so ironic about what you just said is that the reason the school is saying, what are you going to do about it, is because they don't know what
They
to do
don't know
about
what
it.
to do exactly.
And that's a stress response, right?
Uh-huh.
Like when I feel out of control of something. So I'm a teacher, bless their hearts. I'm a teacher. I've got a kid who's like totally causing chaos in my classroom. I have no idea what to do. Now I'm dysregulated. So it is my human instinct to kind of try to put a damper on that dysregulation by making somebody else responsible. What
Must
are
be the
you going to do
parents.
about it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I used to be a hospital social worker, an ER social worker, and we would just, all of us would laugh with each other about how the hospital staff was like, thought we walked around with these magic wands. Like, you wouldn't believe the things that they would call the social worker for, because they got dysregulated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when they got dysregulated and didn't know what to do, there was this way that they like pushed the problem off to someone else. Very normal stress response.
Yes. Yes.
So I understand why the educators are doing that. And it is perpetuating this belief, right? Of, oh my gosh, apparently this is my fault.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And so I think there's a lot of other things we can talk about, but I do think that like really doing, because all of us have our own implicit beliefs that we learned in childhood that teach us that people are in control of other people's behavior. And it's a really big project to kind of, to like really deconstruct that and realize how little control we have over. Here's what I say: I'm hardly in control of my own behavior.
It's true.
Like, there's no way I'm in control of anybody else's. Now, yeah. I try to be in control of other people's behaviors, and so as we kind of talk about the trauma of parenting, I just want to like kind of lay on top of that to really disentangle that, we do have to do some kind of inner work about what we believe we can control in other people. And that's a big thing. But if we look to like kind of some of the leaders in the field of trauma and the stress response system, and we look at like kind of how they're defining trauma and toxic stress. I think it's Dr. Porges who says trauma is really anything that disrupts our capacity to feel safe. And so I'll ask parents, like, has parenting your child ever disrupted your capacity to feel safe? And they're like, yeah, a lot. Right. And we're not talking about like one or two instances. It's pretty chronic. Right. And then it's Dr. Bruce Perry talks about toxic stress as being any kind of stress that's extreme, unpredictable, and prolonged. So then I'll say,
is that parenting?
Yeah, exactly. And they'll say, yes. I'm like, okay. So it makes a lot of sense that your nervous system is now responding in the way that traumatized nervous system is responding, right? That if we talk about our kids' vulnerability and their sensitized stress response systems, that's happened to us as well.
Yes.
And that's just scratching the surface. And there's traumatic memory, right? How many parents tell you that anytime the phone rings, their heart starts pounding because they're afraid that when they pick up the phone, it's going to be, someone else telling them how bad their kid is behaving.
Yes.
Right.
Well, myself, anytime there's a noise that is coming from a big loud noise that comes from the basement, I'm like,
yeah,
what's happening? It could be somebody dropped a box or slammed a door,
exactly.
But your nervous system is on high alert all the time.
Yes. Yeah. So when I teach, I talk about, and when I write in my book, and I talk about how the nervous system has really just two settings. It's either in connection mode or it's in protection mode. And that depends on like the level of safety that we're neuroseving in the environment and in ourselves. And so what happens, of course, when you're parenting a child who's so vulnerable in their nervous system, when you're parenting a child who is chronically in protection mode themselves,
right,
then our nervous system shifts and starts to be chronically in protection mode as well, because the nervous system's entire job is to assess for safety, and it's doing it constantly. And if it is having a very repeated experience of like, oh, not safe, oh, not safe, oh, not safe again, eventually the nervous system sort of is just like, I'm going to stop asking. That's kind of a waste of time. I'm going to not ask if I'm safe or not. And I'm just assuming that I'm not safe.
But I'm not.
Yeah.
So
And
is that
then,
where like the hypervigilance comes from with, you know, like constantly being on guard that something's going to happen? Is that where that comes from? Is that nervous system saying, I'm on all the time?
yeah. So hypervigilance would be, and the way you're describing it would be a nervous system response to going down what being in protection mode and going down what I call the watchdog
Mm,
pathway, right? There's extra energy in that hypervigilance, right? It's like,
mhm,
what's happening? What's going on?
mhm.
This like hair trigger. So hypervigilance is a great adaptive nervous system response, but we're supposed to not get stuck there,
Mhm. It's
right?
exhausting to live there.
It's it was literally exhausting. Like the amount of calories
Yes.
that we burn living in protection mode is more, and
Yeah.
so we start to see people who live in chronic stress have higher rates of autoimmune disorders and metabolic disorders. And we start to see the impact even on our physical health. And it's because of all that's happening that is absolutely exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes so much sense. So, what can we do as parents? How do we calm that nervous system? How do we help heal our nervous system so we're not
Mhm.
constantly living in this trauma response, hypervigilance, etc.?
Well, I have some very practical ideas. And before I get into them, I want to say I think it's crucial as parents and as people who support parents that we recognize that our society gives the least amount of help and support to the people who need it the most. Right. We are
Amen.
constantly expecting our most vulnerable people to be the ones who make the biggest changes and adjustments. We do this across the board. And so the reason that's relevant to this discussion is because if we put too much responsibility, if we put the responsibility to heal the trauma in the nervous system solely on the parent who's experiencing the trauma, we are in a way almost kind of perpetuating that trauma
Mm.
by kind of telling them this is something that's in your control. And the reality is our systems and our culture and our cultural values, so many things are set up. I would actually say on purpose, but that's up for debate, I suppose. We're set up to fail.
Mm. Mhm.
And of course, we're experiencing trauma when no medical professional has ever been helpful.
Yes. Or mental
And
health
not only
professional. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
or maybe they've actually been harmful, or they have told us that we're the crazy
Mhm.
ones,
Mhm.
right? Or they recommend a treatment that's probably a wonderful treatment idea and would actually be really helpful, but it's completely inaccessible,
Yes.
right? It's too far away. It costs way too much money. So even well-meaning professionals, I'm sure that's true about me, can kind of unintentionally cause some harm. But then, of course, we know there's also many professionals who are just bad. Like they're just not doing their job well. And
Yeah.
there's no way around that.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to say, and sometimes the things they recommend like aren't accessible due to the fact that I am exhausted and
Exactly.
I am traumatized and I don't have the bandwidth to put all these systems in place at home or to read these 3 books or and
Yeah.
so there may be some great tips, but give it to me, you know, a seed at a time because I don't have the capability to do these things.
No, I mean, your brain is too stressed out to even process information in
Yes.
that organized kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, there's so many families that what they need is like somebody to come in and make telephone calls, fill out paperwork, write all of their appointments in their planner so that they can be less likely to miss
Come clean their
appointments.
house.
Totally.
Right.
Grocery shop.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
basics that feel overwhelming because we're just
Right.
trying to live. We're just
Right.
trying to stay alive. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
you
So
get it. You get it. And this is such an important conversation because it's not talked about enough.
it's never talked about hardly at
Mhm.
all. I think
Mhm.
certainly not in like mainstream. Again, there's this very American bootstraps
Mhm.
mentality that if you're struggling, it must be your fault in
Mhm.
some way.
Mhm.
Um, and everybody's kind of unwilling to take responsibility for the role that they have played in this kind of on a big picture scale. So again, before I start, I just wanted to kind of say that before I started giving like actual practical
Yes. Well, and I never
advice.
thought of that adds layers to the shame and trauma, things like that, because you're being blamed for things that you really don't have control over.
Oh no.
And you're just like, okay, well, I fed my kids today, so that's about as much as I can do, you know? So I'd never thought about it that way. That's a really important point that we're just not getting the support necessary.
One of the things I teach the families I work with to ask when their kids are really struggling is what would this child need for their success to be inevitable? And almost always there's an answer to that question. So I think about a kiddo that I knew who was in high school and was always in trouble at passing periods
Mm.
and wasn't going to their next class. And,
Mhm. I
and I'm
do.
like, well, y'all, like the child, they can't be unsupervised. Like this is a regulation issue. Like the child needs more co-regulation. Like think about this as a 3-year-old, right? Like we wouldn't send a 3-year-old through 8 passing periods in a day and expect them to do it well. Like that's essentially what we're asking. I understand this is an 11th grader, but essentially, if we looked at their brain development and their regulatory circuitry, like we're essentially asking the same thing. So of course they're not being successful. So what that child needs for their success to be inevitable is a regulated adult who is always with them
Mhm.
in passing periods.
That they can trust. Yes.
Right. Now, I actually had a child whose school did that for them in high school. And 99% of kids would never be able to get that, that at school. And so sometimes when we ask that question, like, what does a child need for their success to be inevitable? And you're like, well, they need an adult with them at all times. And then you say to yourself, well, that's not possible. Okay, maybe it's not possible, but man, that just hits home the fact that our kids are struggling
Yeah.
because of system failures.
Yeah.
And if
I
they
have
had
a
what they needed, they would do okay.
Yes, I have a child who middle school just like was so overwhelming. The noise, the
Yeah.
smells,
Yeah.
the buzzing of the lights, the kids touching back and forth. And so we asked,
Yeah.
can he leave class a few minutes early to get to his next class before the passing period starts? Oh no, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
He can't do it himself. We have nobody that can walk with him. And it's like, that's what he needs in order to be successful. He wants to be at school. He wants to be successful. He's not a behavior problem, but man, he can't handle this. So I'm with
Right.
you that sometimes the things that the kids need, it won't be provided.
Exactly. And then they'll continue to get in trouble
Yeah.
for not.
Even kids who are not behavior, quote unquote, behavior issues,
Right.
they will be to get what they need. It's like you said, it's a survival mechanism. I need to get what I need, so I need to be loud and a behavior issue. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that said, I when I'm thinking about parents who are all the way what I call kind of down the possum pathway, right? As I said, I look at the nervous system these two ways. I'm a play therapist, so had all these playful metaphors. We've got the watchdog pathway, the possum pathway. The possum pathway is the stress response system that's starting to shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, when I meet parents who are using words like burnt out, compassion fatigue, my nervous system is fried, I just can't do this anymore,
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff. Those parents are pretty far down the possum pathway, pretty chronically.
Yeah.
Right. And that's absolutely traumatic. You are experiencing trauma if you're stuck on the possum pathway.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way around that. Right. So I think, and And sometimes folks who are stuck on the possum pathway do have like the occasional watchdog behavior, right? That sometimes really burnt out parents find themselves screaming like a banshee at their kid, right? Because again, their stress response system is almost non-existent. And so they find themselves just sort of like losing it, right? And then collapsing back. And the possum pathway sounds like words of hopelessness, helplessness. I can't do this anymore. This is never going to get better. I'm stuck here forever. My life is ruined. Those are the words of like the possum pathway. So what we know about what the possum pathway needs is, and you actually already said this, teeny tiny little micro moments of safety. And that is kind of crummy because people who are that stressed out and overwhelmed and traumatized feel like they need something quite monumental in order to feel better. They have a real hard time believing that it's the teeny tiny things that will help them. Also, it's just kind of really unfair. It's like the people who need, a week at the spa could never get it. I mean, that's completely impossible.
Yes.
Like you couldn't leave your kids with anybody. You can't there's 1,000 reasons why that's impossible. And there's a lot of grief inherent in that, right? That like what I need and what so many other people get, I don't get. I can't just tap out. I can't be like, honey, I need a night out. Could you watch the kids? I'm going to go out with my friends for dinner. Like, even if you could do that, it wouldn't help because it's not actually anything. Really what you exactly. Yeah. So what the possum pathway needs are as regular and as repeatedly as possible, teeny tiny little, what I would say, like teeny tiny little moments of healing, teeny tiny little moments of safety, teeny tiny little moments of kind of coming into connection and presence with yourself. And they really could be like moments, like 5 seconds of noticing how much you love your really hot cup of coffee in the morning. Or I'm a really big coffee addict and I'm very particular about the coffee beans I buy and the cream that I buy. And so even if kids are screaming it over here, I still have, right? Like my favorite cream that I could take 2 seconds. I'm sorry, not 2 minutes, 2 seconds to just notice like, oh, this is good.
Yes.
It's 2 seconds of safety. And again, I know that if you're like really stuck on the possum pathway and you're hopeless and helpless and you're like, I can't do this anymore. I hate parenting. I mean, that's not something someone could say to me I haven't heard before about how they feel about parenting and how they feel about their kids and what they want to do to their kids. I've heard it. I've literally heard it all.
Heard it all. Yes.
All of it. And so I get that. I know that place. And I know it feels like starting to try to pay attention to these teeny tiny little moments of safety feels just so ridiculous. Like, I'm sorry, my life is on fire and you want me to notice my coffee tastes good? Yes. So stupid. Like, obviously you don't even get it. I get that.
Yeah.
But I would ask that person if it felt right in that moment to just pause and be like, what actually are your other options?
Yeah.
Because if you had other options that allowed you to have more than 3 seconds of nervous system rest, you would have taken them by now.
Right.
It really is our only option. And in some ways, it's okay that it's our only option because it really is actually what that level of nervous system trauma really is what that level of nervous system trauma needs is these teeny tiny. It would be like, if you could do more, it would be like dumping a 5-gallon bucket over a teeny tiny little funnel. Like you couldn't make use of it, right? It would all just overflow and be not helpful, right? We need a tiny little drop to go down the tiny little funnel.
Yes.
And so I talk with parents a lot about what are those things you can do? What are the little things you can notice? What are the little things you can experience? I am a huge, I know this has gotten a little cliche, but I'm a huge teacher of and believer in self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And someone asked me recently, like, how can you teach all the self-compassion stuff to people who like essentially need what we already talked about, right? Like they need people to come in and like actually do something. And you're over here talking about self-compassion. I'm like, listen, I get it. Also, I can't go and go grocery shopping for you. But actually having somebody come in and go grocery shopping for you is only going to be so helpful if we never bring in the experience of self-compassion. Compassion moves our nervous system from protection mode to connection mode.
Mm.
Whether we're offering it to somebody or offering it to ourselves. Compassion is what I'll often say is compassion is the neurobiology of change. And so developing some sort of practice of compassion, and which could mean starting with being in relationship with people who believe in compassion. Just knowing those people, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're not giving it to you necessarily. They're not saying, oh, you should have more compassion for yourself. It's more neutral than that. And then I think practicing giving compassion to other people,
Especially our
which
kids.
most of us are pretty good at. Yeah.
Yeah. Those kids who are struggling, sometimes we lose compassion for them.
Oh, of course we do, because
Yeah.
we can't have compassion and be on the protection pathway.
Mm,
They literally don't go together. So if we're stuck in protection mode, we are not going to have compassionate thoughts towards our kids.
Fascinating.
And it's not because we're bad.
Right. It's just how the nervous system works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's really something to think about. So that's one of the reasons why we need to work on these tiny little moments so that we can have that compassion for ourselves and our kids, right? We're not always in protection.
Exactly.
So it's not just something nice to do to notice your coffee. It's vital to do.
It
to
actually
have
is
something. Yeah.
I know. And I know it sounds so foolish. And people have done also, like, people roll their eyes and like, and I get that. And all of those people are so welcome to have those feelings with me, because I really get that. And it isn't just like enjoy your cup of coffee. It really actually is take 2 seconds to shift into connection mode. That really is what we're doing. I'm just trying to give people a little bit more practical advice than that, right? Like notice how much you enjoy that, or notice this, or this will sound really silly, but we moved from Texas to Michigan a couple of years ago. And one of the things that's really different about there's a lot of things that are very different, but the water that comes out of the tap in Michigan is much colder than the water that comes out of the tap in Texas. And it's so luxurious to brush your teeth with really cold water.
Right.
And I brush my teeth every day.
And
so
just noticing that. And I think for myself, when I start noticing those little things, I start noticing more of them.
Exactly.
You know, I'm a big nature girl. I live in Utah. The mountains are right outside my front door. I walk out my front door every day and I'm like, I can't believe I live here. I can't believe
I'll tell you what. I used to live in Salt Lake City.
Oh, you did?
Yes. You did. So I know exactly that.
Yes.
I can't believe I live here.
I can't believe I get to see this view every day.
Yeah.
And then you start noticing more, like, oh my gosh, look at how beautiful the colors are in the fall. And I think you're onto something, because it's not just about the creamer. It's about being present. And so, yes. Oh,
and it doesn't change the disaster that is happening in your life. And I wish it did, but it doesn't.
Right.
But it does make it a little easier on your nervous system to deal with the chaos that's happening, and can slowly, incrementally over time, help your nervous system come out of burnout. Now, there's all sorts of other things that we could do if people have access. I talk to people about good nutrition. You know, sometimes seeing a physician who can really help you with the metabolic stuff and with what's, happening in your body. If you can move your body a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we if once we start to feel a little bit better, then these other things start to feel a little bit
More
easier. Like, who wants to
accessible.
eat
Yeah.
healthy when they feel terrible?
Yeah.
Nobody.
Sometimes going on a walk feels completely overwhelming to me, but I'm like, if I can just
Yes.
get outside and walk up and down my street, it always turns into something longer.
Yes.
Get out for 3 minutes, get some
Yeah.
sunshine on your face, and you'll probably end up out there for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is so helpful because so just those little things can lead us to things that actually can even be more helpful. So
Yeah, it's a little snowball.
it's
I
a little
have
snowball.
actually, and I know that it's weird that I know this off the top of my head, but I just gave it to someone. I have a fun little one-page infographic that people seem to really like called What to Do When Your Nervous System is
Mm,
Fried.
mm,
And it's pictures. It's really easy to even like reference and just
mhm,
see like the little
mhm.
icon, which can be grabbed at robyngobbel.com/fried graphic.
Okay. I will list that
Yeah.
in the show notes so that people can go get it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're like, I don't know what I can do. But if you have a picture right in
Yeah.
front of you, that can
Yeah.
be really helpful.
Yeah.
Wow, so much to think about. And I think we could go on for another couple of hours, but I just so appreciate your knowledge and sharing this with us. It's such important information. Will you tell us about the book that you just published that would be so helpful to families who are dealing with this?
Yeah. So my first book is called Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors, Brain Body Sensory Strategies That Really Work. And it takes families through kind of what my three core pieces are, which is first, let's understand like the science of behavior and the science
Mhm,
of the nervous system
mhm,
in a way that's actually useful, right? Like I only want to teach people stuff that's useful. And then the second section is all like tools, super practical. Here are things you can do to both what I say, like grow the owl brain, strengthen that stress response system, as well as calm the watchdog and the possum brain, like
mhm,
really, heal the vulnerabilities in the nervous system. And then the third section is all about us, like how this has impacted us, how to take care of us. And so then again, yeah, lots of practical strategies about same thing, like what can we do to strengthen our stress response system outside the moment? And then also what can we do in the moment when we're about to lose our mind
mhm,
and we
mhm.
want to try not to.
Yes.
Like some steps we might be able to take in those moments to try to not necessarily stay calm, but maybe just
Not totally lose it.
not totally lose it. So you can get it anywhere that books are sold. And I also have a podcast. So
Great.
easy, free
What's your podcast
resource,
called?
The Baffling Behavior Show.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I will link
Yeah.
all of those things in the show notes so people can access you. You also are a great follow on Instagram. It's your name, Robyn Gobbel.
Yep.
And I've learned a lot from you. So I so appreciate you
Mm,
putting this, educating families. And, I've recommended you to even people who may not have this happening in their home, but want to
yeah.
understand better.
Yeah.
So this is for everybody to
Good.
understand more.
Good.
So
I'm so glad it's been helpful and I'm so grateful and appreciative of what you do. I mean, we need all the help we can get, right? Like
we
as
need
many
all the
people
help
out in the
we can get.
world
Yes.
helping families. Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for being here and appreciate you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.